Welcome to the Mason Dukacek Show. And before we jump in, this episode is brought to you by WorkforceAlchemy.com, helping leaders uncover hidden profit leaks inside their workforce. Today's guest is Charles Lee, CEO of Ideation, who has worked alongside leaders at companies like Google, Toyota, and Vanguard to solve one of the toughest challenges in business, and that's turning strategy into consistent execution. He's also the founder of the Ideation Conference and author of the upcoming Wiley book, Design Your Good Life. Charles helps leaders close the gap between great ideas and real results. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mason. It's a real pleasure.
So I know you've worked with some of the most respected organizations in the world. What is the most common reason that strategy fails once it leaves the boardroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's kind of interesting because sometimes strategy doesn't fail because of the idea. It's really often sometimes some of the relational challenges and tensions of who's all on board. It may be limited by systems or standards of practice. And so, it's not just the idea, but everything else that surrounds the idea that allows it. And then some ideas, a good example is I was talking with an executive and how they would assign projects that may last 2-3 years to somebody to be in charge. But by year 2, sometimes that person will transition to a different department, for example. And that's just kind of a practical reality that then the project stalls a little bit, or sometimes this project never sees the light of day. And it's no wonder that they say, I think over 90% of innovation projects actually fail within businesses.
Why do you think that is? I mean, you talked a little bit about
Yeah.
systems and whatnot,
Yeah.
and people.
Yeah.
Let's get in the weeds there. Well, what do you think? I mean, 90%'s a lot, and I don't doubt it. What's your take?
Yeah, I think some of that is, once again, all of the various transitioning that happens. I think strategic priorities can become reactive to what's happening in the market or what's happening in the business. And that constant reshuffling often causes delays or significant detours from what a project had originally intended to be.
So what do you think about the people aspect?
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with Bill Cates, Cates, and he wrote a book, and our conversation was about radical relevancy. We were talking about the benefits of the benefit. Like if you go to a company and you're trying to sell a product or service, a lot of people are like, oh, you can make more profit or you can reduce your costs. If you're talking to the owner or the CEO, that makes sense. But if you're talking to everyone else who's involved in that project, they're asking, well, what does that mean to me? Because if that means no more pay, but a lot more hours or a lot more stress or a lot more time away from my family by traveling, then I'm not so interested in this. And they don't become champions of that new idea. And that's why I could see if you have a team of people trying to get an idea executed,
Absolutely.
and the person leading that team doesn't have a good grasp on what the benefits of the benefits are. What does this proposed change mean on a personal level to each of these people? If they don't take that stuff into consideration, you may have nothing but obstacles and roadblocks to getting that idea. I'm not even saying having help. I'm saying you got people that are getting in the way to try to make sure this new idea doesn't see the light of day. I'm sure you deal with this all the time. Can you give us a couple examples of some of those you've seen come to life?
Yeah, I think because by nature, people who are in executive positions are thinking big vision, trying to look way ahead into the future value creation of the business, that it's possible that in the handoff and delegation, a lot of assumptions are in play. The assumption that people have capacity, like you just mentioned, that people have interest or clarity. I think that's another thing is leaders can have a general sense and it may be cloudy in their minds, but then they delegate the task and it just gets even more murky for those underneath. And people reacting, adding, and depending on the culture of the business, if people who are directly reporting have a culture where they have to say yes and have to kind of portray that, hey, we're all on the same quote unquote team, then it becomes very troubling. And you can kind of tell in body languages. I've sat in meetings with managers where a leader will share a vision. Hey, this is the direction we want to go. And you could kind of see the eye rolling. You could see a little bit of the stress, confusion as to what's going to go, what does this mean for everything I'm doing? I already have 5 projects I have to work on and our team's already spent. Are you going to give us more budget to do this? So, and especially because in most teams, you have a lot of people who are focused on execution. And those who are focused on execution are calculating like into the weeds, into the details that often executive leaders aren't thinking about. So without the proper comms or the communication or the continual reiteration of a new idea, people may get excited initially, but once they think about the work, that's when you, in the innovation curve, you've probably seen, you go into kind of the trough of disillusionment and frustration because this new reality is no longer a fun vision. It just becomes a grind and even more of a burden into kind of day-to-day operations.
So I know you talk about a translation gap between ideas and execution.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like inside a company on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that communications point. I think really that, when you have something that you're launching for the first time or a way of doing work, and maybe a new system, and maybe a new business approach, and maybe a new product, is that you have to know kind of where your people are at. When you're first giving the vision, it's so important to reiterate more times than you think you ought to reiterate. The sheer initial excitement will wean off and the shock will settle in as to what this new reality of a new product or service might be, or a new way of doing work. And it's in those moments that people don't necessarily need necessarily more clarity about what you're doing. Clarity is always good, but there are times in that process where you need more morale boosting, reminding people why this new approach or a new system or a new product makes sense for the business as a whole, and how to build morale. And people are going to start to feel like, well, maybe I don't know how to do this new thing you just assigned me with. And that's where leaders ought to focus on like professional development, giving them the tools and resources and often the budgets to be able to actually execute on top of all their other responsibilities, so that eventually people kind of get into what's often called like the plateau of productivity, where they start to see that, okay, I can see how this is kind of integrated. I feel a little bit not just motivated but equipped to do the work. And I think it's just kind of navigating the ebbs and flows and being in continual contact with those you've delegated responsibilities to. And then for those who are receiving this, getting in the practice of communicating up, right? Asking good questions, maybe more questions than complaints, right? I think framing it in a question format and asking, hey, you might say, I like the direction we're going. In order for me to be successful in attaining this goal for our business, would you help me in areas A, B, and C? And I think really framing it that way, it feels like we're still on the same boat and we're going to push forward, but it's going to take some recalibrating. I think, and smart leaders know that people need time for change. And I think that's part of the innovation process.
So what are the earliest signs that a strategy is going to stall before leadership even realizes it?
Outside of the rolling eyes in the
Rolling
room.
eyes and the arms across the chest and the scowl.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other than those, what are some of the early signs?
Yeah, I think some of the early signs may include people's inability to articulate what is it that they're actually moving towards. And that might be a basic sign, but I think if I were a leader delegating new vision, I would ask often as to what people understood the vision to be. And that's such a practical thing, is because when the direction is unclear, and when the actions are delegated, but it doesn't come with clarity around what that actually means. And you may not know exactly what it means, but if there isn't an invitation to have a feedback loop throughout the process, I think those are really red flags for me. And the second thing is, if people feel like any significant initiative should feel as if people have ownership behind it. So if they weren't built into the process at the early stages of even ideation with input, expertise, some maybe pre-planning before something launches, those are all red flags for me, in that either the leader just worked in isolation or just worked off a ton of assumptions based on previous experience.
So where do you think most leaders get stuck when they're trying to turn plans into executing the plans? Where do you think most of them get stuck?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it could be in multiple areas, but I think some of the common areas that common like moments I feel like they get stuck is like when a leader actually starts to get to the point of actually launching it. I'm not sure if you or your listeners or viewers have read books like from Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art. And he talks about like there's always this part of our brain that kicks in. He calls it the lizard brain, that before you actually launch something, all these hypothetical reasons as to why your idea won't work will kind of bubble up. All your insecurities will bubble up. And sometimes leaders kind of get stuck in perfection. And I feel like sometimes as you're trying to roll out, even leaders will pull back and make reasons why, hey, we're going to give it another 3 months or another 6 months because it's safer not to go out and do something. It's actually, it feels like a lot of risk. But in actuality, all those doubts behind an idea that, you know, causes someone to get stuck are really probably most of those reasons are not real. They're not based in reality. They're based in really our own insecurity. And I see a lot of people kind of tripping over whether they're the ones executing, the one who has vision, and they'll come up with all kinds of reasons why we don't have the budget, we don't have the time. And some of those may be legitimate, but a lot of those actually are not in each context.
It's fascinating to me to think about because I'm reflecting right now as you talk about about these things on projects that I've been involved with and
Hmm.
how some things just they do stall and you just want to tell the person leading it like excellent now is better than perfect never. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
be perfect.
Yeah.
And all these fears that they start talking about and all these concerns, not that they're not legitimate, but not that they're not legitimate or that they couldn't happen, but
Yeah.
it's like you can't prepare for every single possibility. Sometimes you
Absolutely.
just gotta use your best judgment, take action, notice what's working, what isn't, and adjust. Quote to
Yeah.
Tony Robbins style there. But
Yeah. Yeah. I would even add to that, like, usually the idea you start with is rarely the idea you end up with. And you won't even know which questions to really ask until you start. That's just kind of the nature of
so you don't know
innovation. And
what
I
you
think,
don't know. And the other thing that I find fascinating, and I'm going to say this for the benefit of those listening, at least based on my experience, to piggyback on what you're saying, is that there's a lot of ways to accomplish an outcome.
Mhm.
And you can remain flexible in your approach. And if I've got a team of people and I know that this is the outcome I want, and while I may pick Avenue A, they may all like Avenue B or C. And really, if it can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish within the time that we have and within the resources that we've got available, I'm okay with going with B and C if I think it can work. It may not work as well as I think, or it doesn't have to be my idea is my point. And when you start
Correct.
talking about getting the buy-in from those people, that eliminates a lot of friction because now you're supporting their idea on how to achieve a group outcome. And I know this
Yeah,
is
I think you're alluding to something bigger than the idea itself, is the importance of creating a culture of experimentation, a culture of transparency and permission, a culture of safety that allows people to feel like, you know what, you're giving me permission to try this. I'm going to do my best. I'm not just going to wing it. I'm going
right.
to bring in my resources, my knowledge, but that you're with me in this as a leader to help me go pursue, to try to work it out. And I may not have all the answers, but you're giving me permission and trust to do this. And I think that's the culture that is needed. Because if you don't have that, you're always going to be under so much stress and pressure, and you may not even perform well under those set of circumstances because your brain may not function to its full creative capability.
And I'm going to be vulnerable here and share a time that I didn't do that. I picked my way
Mm,
and it didn't work. And when it came time for the conversation with the owner, I owned it. I was like, hey, these guys, we got together. These guys told me, they said this. And I, based on my judgment, I decided to override them and execute it a different way, which did
mm,
not work. This is on me, not them. If I would have listened to them, we wouldn't have to rework this.
yeah,
And what I got was owner wasn't mad. It was a delay. So I mean, not like he was happy, but but the support that I had from my team moving
mm,
forward was way different. It
amazing. Yeah.
was an accelerant because I showed not by my words, but by my deeds that I would own the mistakes, give credit where it was due because they had a
Yeah.
better idea, take ownership of what didn't work. That was on me. But that was an accelerant with that team for all kinds of future projects because they knew they didn't have to fear being thrown under the bus or having someone else take credit for their good ideas. And they knew that I would be much more inclined to listen next time
Yeah.
because they were right and I wasn't. So that
Yeah.
was an accelerant for our
Yeah. I
so
think that you're spot on. Yeah. I think all the research supports that too. People who feel psychological safety at work, meaning that they feel safety in, trying out ideas, working on innovative things, are much more not only creative, but productive.
and I think it helped that the person we were doing the project for understood that we were doing our best and it wasn't and
Yeah.
we did what we could with what we had, but their approach would have been better. But it's still, I ended up having an accelerant out of that. When you see teams that execute at a
Mhm.
high level, Are there some common themes or threads
Yeah.
or best practices that you typically see out of them that you don't see out of others?
Yes. Definitely the objectives or the goals are clear and it's agreed upon at the start of something. And then usually teams that do well allocate one or more actual project managers to it to keep everybody on course. And then they have clear ways of organizing meetings where it's not just updates on everything, but each meeting has a particular descriptor, for example. This is getting very tactical for what type of meeting that is. And it allows people to get on, quick sprints to achieve some objective. There's high transparency. When there's tension, they have actually a protocol for disagreement already in place so that they can work through some of the tension, the challenges of any project that's complex. And then they continue work. And then after the project is done, usually within 7 days, there's some kind of debrief. So those are some like common characteristics I've seen in effective teams that, especially because as the company grows, you're going to have to do interdepartmental collaboration. And that's sort of a little bit of a framework where there's clarity of objectives, clarity of roles, clarity of who's responsible for what, who's going to keep the train moving, what check-ins look like, what happens when there's disagreement, and then ultimately, like, how do you debrief so that you can even do better next time before you move on to the next project?
So I've noticed a theme in your answers when you start talking about things like
Yeah,
clarity. You've mentioned that
yeah,
word a few times.
yeah,
I know a lot of executives feel buried in competing priorities, and it's completely understandable. How do you help them simplify, get clarity, and still have the ability to move forward when things are complex and there's a lot of
yeah.
competing priorities? What advice or guidance do you have for folks in that kind of situation?
Yeah, this may sound like oversimplified answer, but I try to get our clients to write things down or whiteboard stuff out. And it kind of forces like visualization and actually using it more senses in the way you're processing the idea, whether it's writing, speaking, recording yourself talking about it. I found like does achieve a lot of clarity because you have to figure out a way to be in it and yet objective. And so outside of like bringing in thought partners like myself or you and others, is just the constant creating points of reference. And I actually wrote about this in my first book years ago. And in there, it just talks about the miracle of writing, just the power of writing things down so that you are not just talking verbally about what's going on, but you keep documenting because documentation allows for refinement and improvement. So it may be very simple, but clarity often comes when you can actually see your thoughts on paper. And if you have the luxury of having a thought partner in the process, which I would hope a lot of your listeners and viewers have, is to allocate time. If you create time for it, it's amazing how much clarity you can achieve. Even though you think you don't have time, it actually saves you time in the long run. Similar to what you do with your team, is when they can trust you, it just accelerates the innovation, the ability to execute. So it's a simple idea, but it works pretty well no matter the size of the business.
I'm going to piggyback on what you're saying about the thought partner idea. Because I can think of times where I've had ideas and I've thought things through in a blink of an eye, what seems like a blink of an eye, and years have gone by. And a thought partner can come in and say, "Hey, I think you should consider doing X."
Mhm.
And I'm like, "Well, I already thought of that before. I already tried that."
Mm,
Well, what I'm finding is that the same answer can be right or wrong at a different point in time.
yes.
And if you don't have someone to bounce ideas off of, sometimes you will dismiss. I can't say I will have dismissed ideas because, oh, I've already done that, or I already thought about that, or I've already decided why that wouldn't work. But that might have been a ways back. And the circumstances have shifted and things have changed to the
Mm,
point that what wasn't a good idea or wasn't a viable plan then is absolutely a great idea now. And
yeah,
when someone else can come in and look at something objectively with a fresh set of eyes and say, hey, based on the circumstances going on right now, you ought to consider this, you ought to consider it.
yep. I
So
think
I,
that's wisdom. Yeah, I think you're speaking wisdom to people. Like, I think all of us need somebody or somebodies to come in and give us perspective. And as long as you have enough trust in that person where they're going to think about your, like the best interest in mind, that they are hopefully have some track record of thinking clearly themselves and aren't there just to say yes to everything that you're talking about. I think that's really, really good characteristics because you could also surround yourself with team members that have to answer to you And while their input is incredibly important, at the same time, when push comes to shove, there may be areas where it'd be harder for them to be more direct and honest than, say, someone who's an outsider of the business.
Very true. So, how do in your opinion, how do
Yeah.
great leaders maintain big vision while also building discipline into the organization that they're running?
Yeah. I don't know of in my opinion, I guess we could all define great leader differently, but I don't know of a great leader that I would say is really good that doesn't make time to think about these things, no matter how busy they are. It may mean they wake up a lot earlier. For some, it may be going to bed more reflectively before they go to sleep. But I think it's the constant practice of reflection, which seems so easy to do at one level, but very difficult to practice. But it's become part of their rhythm of like their ability to stop and reflect. And now, for example, once read a great book about just kind of creative people, and what they have in common is they write stuff down. They go to places that are much larger than themselves. In other words, it might be the ocean or the mountains to kind of give them perspective about their own existence. And then the third is like they are open to new ideas, put themselves in new environments, stay curious in their life, all those kinds of things. And so for me, I think great leaders that can do that. And it doesn't mean that every time you take time for yourself to reflect has to be deep. It could just be a simple stroll around the beach, or, you know, walking in the hills, walking in your park. But allowing yourself the mental space to reflect should be a part of a daily practice. There may be seasons where I feel like certain people may have a pass for a short season of if you have young children. I know it can get very chaotic, but to the extent that we can control our schedule, try to do that. Or I do this throughout the day. If there's a appointment cancellation, I don't jump up and try to fill that necessarily with something else. At least for some of them, if there's two cancellation, maybe one I may refill with another meeting, but the other one, I may take that time to just kind of power down for a little bit and just kind of reflect. If there's things I need to write down, just do a brain dump so I have less things in my head while I'm even engaging other clients in meetings later in that day.
So, I know that you've built a successful consultancy and a conference. What lessons from your own journey translate directly to your clients?
I think the importance of developing others. I mean, developing relationships. I feel like business flows through relationship. I think ideas flow through relationships. And I think just the regular practice of staying curious. Like one thing I'll do that I encourage my clients to do is go to an event that's outside of your field every year, once a year. So I'll try to go to a conference where it's not my space. I'm not trying to maximize my knowledge in a field. All I'm trying to do is understand how people think, how they solve problems, how they view the world. And it just allows me to think more broadly. And I have the benefit of working across industries. So I could take a lesson from one of our law firm clients and apply it to a museum. And what I realize is often innovation is the result of two or more seemingly unrelated ideas that intersect, where you have kind of that aha moment. And so just continually encouraging others to stay open, because as you become better in what you do, it's very possible that your curiosity levels will dip over time because you're going to bank on what's worked. And most companies will encourage curiosity during the hiring process. But statistically, 6 months in, and I write about this in my book, 6 months in, curiosity levels go way down because people start to conform into things that create incentives or reward. And curiosity is a nice principle, not as rewarded in most businesses. So I think just staying curious, staying humble, staying open to ideas has really helped build our business, because ultimately you meet great people and you end up doing great work together. And that's the power of relationship.
Well, you said something very, very valuable there, and you have me reflecting on things. First book I wrote in 1999, and it only took me a few days.
Hmm.
And the reason it only took me a few days was because I used to work for a nationally known sales trainer, and one of the first things he taught me, he said, "Your worst pen is better than your best memory. Always take notes."
Hmm.
And I was talking to business owners and executives in multiple industries. And
Yeah.
what I learned was that someone from industry A had figured out the solution to the problem that industry B is facing. And someone in
Hmm.
industry B had figured out a solution to the problem that someone in industry C had been dealing with. And someone in C had figured out something that someone in industry D had been struggling with, and the reality was I had notes on what all of these people did to overcome these
Mm,
challenges, and after a certain point in time, they gave me all these amazing answers, and I was able to
there you
assemble it
go.
into a book because I paid attention and I valued their
Yeah.
time enough to take good notes. But I learned
Yep.
a lot. So when you're talking about going to conferences in different industries or different perspectives, can you
Yeah.
I don't wanna put you on the spot. Well, maybe I do. I'll put you on the spot. Can you share maybe one takeaway that you
Yeah.
didn't expect that you would get from a conference that was outside of your industry or your niche that was something that you could apply or did apply?
Yeah, I would give it's an adjacent industry. We do some work in it on the creative side because our company has a consultancy as well as a creative studio. So I went to I am not a developer. So I went to a developer conference and I was sitting in the room with like that. At the time, head of HTML5 for Microsoft, or people were starting like startups and new ways of coding, new languages. And what I took away from there is definitely engineers think about problems a lot differently. I assume they would be a little bit more systematic and logical in their flow, but I was really impressed by how some of them stayed so open to design concepts or ideas that maybe what I would deem more creative people would approach problem solving, but they were so open. They didn't hold to their ideas so sacredly as if like this is the right way to do it. They kind of were trying to be intellectually honest enough to keep an open hand so that if they were developing something in a way that was not as efficient, they have a spirit of this kind of collaboration, this kind of open source collaboration. This is probably why if you go online, platforms like WordPress do so well. It's because it's like an open platform where developers help each other out in developing code that makes sense for all these various use case scenarios. So I was reminded that, man, even though I love my ideas and I feel justified in it, I still need to hold my ideas like this versus grasping onto it. Because if the goal is to just make the idea better, I have to welcome differing views, differing perspectives to challenge it minimally and validate my idea or make it better by changing it. So I think that was kind of a key takeaway I got from them.
I had a conversation recently with John Malura. He was on the podcast, and he was an engineer, worked on
Mhm.
projects with NASA, and he was talking about and it's not a mentality that I had because 'cause I've always been like, "You do your best, you make your best better," and his thing from an engineer perspective
Yep.
was he said, "If the requirement is that a piece can hold 50 pounds, then you move on. Once you get it to that, you don't move on. It's not like, oh, let's
Mm,
make it 60, let's make it 70, because anything
yeah.
above what's required in his world is wasteful
Mm,
and counterproductive. And it causes exponential delays and exponential increases in cost. And in the world that I typically grew up in, it's like, well, we're not going to do the minimum required. We're going to do better, better, better.
yeah.
But he's like, if this is what is required, it's written into the specifications, and all of the engineers and all of the scientists have figured out that this is exactly what we need. No more, no less, but this is exactly what we need. Then it was helpful for me to be around someone who thought differently because I was like, in that
So good.
set of circumstances, he's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I love that.
I
I love that.
appreciate your willingness to step outside of your comfort zone and to maintain your curiosity. So how do you create real accountability on a team without turning it into a pressure cooker or causing micromanagement to occur?
Yeah, I think really defining what the purpose of that accountability is. It is not just a grade, right? It is to keep us on course, remind us of our North Star, and remind us of like the fact that everyone's time and resources are valuable. And I think it's respecting each other. And when accountability is kind of framed in that kind of spirit, then it becomes a helpful tool through which you can achieve more together versus it being some type of like grading that happens at the end of like a test or things of that nature. So we try to view accountability as part of the process, not so much like the end score.
Cool. So can you share a few key points from your new book and tell us why you wrote it?
Yeah, years ago, I wrote a book called Good Idea, Now What? And that was all about idea execution. This time around, I wanted to expand it beyond, of course, it talks a lot to a lot of things that happen in the professional world, from like curiosity to ideation, moving from a proof of concept to a proof of value behind the work that you do. But I wanted to expand it out all the way into areas of like influence. So it does talk about like discovering your purpose. And it's a framework. Not trying to provide a formula, just a framework of getting like the three phases are spark. For those who are curious and feel like something's on the horizon, I talk about things like curiosity, ideation, and get to a place where you have a sense of direction. But people who may already have that, I have a second phase in the book called actualize. And it's all about implementation and creating value so that when you enter a room, you actually have proof of value that you provide the person you're talking with. So you can be more confident. You can be more secure about what is it that I'm actually bringing to the table. And then the last phase is for people who already have had some success and have actually executed well, where I try to challenge individuals, including myself, to say, hey, if you've had success, you're probably in a place where you can exert some positive influence in the world. So it's moving from being the best in the world in something to be the best for the world in something. And it's just
Very
kind
cool.
of that shift of like, hey, how do we curate our relationships and our resources to create more lasting impact in the world? So that when you do all of that, you end up with whatever you deem your good life is. My suspicion is your good life would include some sense of purpose, some alignment with your values and your passions, and that the outcome will not only benefit you, but benefit others as well. And so the book tries to bring in a little bit more holistically, both our personal and professional lives. And so I'm really proud of the project. It's undergirded in a ton of research in all of these various areas, certain mindsets you need, skill sets you need, but it's meant to be sort of a guide. And I wrote each chapter so that there's personal stories, there's research, and at the end, there's questions and exercises and exercises that you can go through to kind of walk you through a process, and you could take it wherever you want it to go.
Wonderful. So if people listening want to know more about you and your work, what's the best ways for
Yeah.
them to connect and where can they get your book?
Yeah. They can get my book pretty much anywhere. All the book distributors, as well as Target, Walmart, a lot of retail stores have it as well. But far as online, you could either just go to designyourgoodlife.com or
Okay,
literally look up my name, Charles Lee, and our company Ideation, and you should be able to find me in any channel.
cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mason, for the opportunity. Appreciate it.